I thought that once the shelves were bare and the drawers empty, the weight inside me would loosen. But the silence that followed felt heavier than the clutter I had carried for years. It struck me like a question I wasn't ready for. Can emptiness heal, or does it just echo louder? As I stood in the hollow of my own apartment, the air felt too still, like it was waiting for me to confess something I hadn't named. I had given away 90% of what I owned, yet it felt like I had only made more space for the truth I kept avoiding. The walls watched me, unblinking, as if they knew this wasn't freedom. I wondered if simplicity had weight of its own, a kind that pressed inward instead of out. And for the first time, I felt afraid of my own space. The first night after the purge felt strangely loud. Every sound bounced off the bare walls, as if the room was trying to speak before I did. I lay awake, wondering why the emptiness didn't feel peaceful, the way everyone promised. It felt like the quiet had teeth. I could hear my own breathing in a way that made me feel like a guest inside my life, not the owner of it. I realized how often noise had shielded me, from memories, from choices, from the pressure of admitting I wasn't okay. Without distractions, even the smallest thoughts felt huge. I thought minimalism would calm my mind, but instead it exposed everything I tried to hide. Maybe freedom doesn't come from removing things, but from facing what stays behind when nothing else does. In the morning, sunlight filled the room with a brightness that felt too blunt. It revealed everything I had ignored last night. The dust I never noticed, the marks on the wall where shelves used to hang, the hollow that sat somewhere between my ribs. I walked slowly across the floor, the echo of each step sounding like a reminder that I was still here, even if everything else wasn't. I thought this space would feel freeing, but instead it felt like a mirror I couldn't escape. I kept waiting for relief, for clarity, for any sign that I had made the right choice. But the emptiness didn't answer me. It simply watched, patient and unmoving, as though it knew something I didn't. By midday, I found myself pacing the room without purpose, as if movement alone could fill the silence. Every corner felt like it held the memory of something I had removed, and yet none of those objects were what I really missed. What unsettled me was the strange weight in my chest, the kind that grows when you sense you've forgotten something important about yourself. I wondered if I had mistaken fullness for clutter, or if I had stripped away pieces of my life that once kept me steady. I thought I was creating space for peace, but the space only magnified my unease. Maybe the real clutter wasn't in the drawers. Maybe it was in me. As the day faded, the emptiness settled deeper, almost like it was becoming part of the air itself. I sat in the center of the room, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself this was just an adjustment phase. But the truth pressed through the silence. I had given away so much, yet I had avoided the one thing I needed to confront. My mind wasn't quiet. It was crowded with everything I had refused to feel. I realized then that I hadn't decluttered my life. I had only decluttered my distractions. And the moment I let that thought in, the stillness around me felt less like peace and more like a message I could no longer ignore. The second morning felt heavier than the first. The echo inside the apartment no longer sounded like emptiness. It sounded like a question repeating itself, waiting for me to answer. I made tea just to have something warm to hold, something that reminded me I still lived here. But even the steam rising from the cup looked out of place in a room stripped of everything familiar. I had expected clarity by now. Instead, I felt like the walls were nudging me toward thoughts I didn't want to face. Every corner held a quiet sort of truth, one that whispered that physical clutter had never been the problem. The real noise had always been inside me. And now that nothing was left to drown it out, the silence finally had room to speak. When I walked into the living room, I noticed something strange. Without furniture to absorb sound, my footsteps seemed to bounce back at me. as if the room was asking why I kept pacing instead of listening. I paused in the center, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing against my chest. It wasn't the kind of silence that comforts. It was the kind that reveals. I had told myself that empty space would make me feel free, but freedom felt different than this. This felt like standing in front of a mirror that reflected not my face, but the parts of me I kept hidden. I wondered if minimalism had stripped away more than belongings. Maybe it had stripped away the excuses I had been leaning on for years. I tried sitting on the floor to steady myself, but even that felt unfamiliar. Without furniture, the room didn't feel like mine. It felt like a place I was only visiting. My thoughts kept circling, tapping at memories I had long buried under busyness and belongings. I realized how much noise I used to create just to avoid listening to myself. Now the silence had nowhere to hide. It filled every inch of space waiting for me. I wondered if this was what healing looked like. Uncomfortable, unfiltered, unprotected. Maybe I wasn't supposed to feel free yet. Maybe I was supposed to feel everything I had avoided. As the day stretched on, I found myself drifting from wall to wall, touching the blank surfaces as if they held memories I had forgotten. The silence no longer felt like an enemy, but it wasn't a friend yet either. It was something in between, something waiting for me to catch up to it. I felt a strange pull toward the emptiness, like it wanted me to look deeper past the simple idea of owning less. Maybe letting go of objects wasn't enough. Maybe I had to let go of the stories I'd told myself too. The ones that kept me small, the ones that kept me stuck. The space around me felt like an invitation to start again, if I was willing to face myself first. By evening, the echo no longer startled me. It felt almost familiar, like a voice I had forgotten how to hear. I sat near the window, watching the sky turn soft and weightless, and I finally understood that the emptiness wasn't accusing me. It was revealing me. The space wasn't asking why I had removed so much. It was asking what I planned to do with what remained. The quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt honest. And even though I was still unsure, I could sense the beginning of something shifting. Something subtle. Something fragile. Something real. Jonah stopped by without warning, and for a moment, I wished I still had a couch for him to sit on so the room wouldn't feel so confrontational. He stood there looking around, not judging, just observing in that quiet way that made me uneasy. When he asked how I was doing, I told him I felt lighter, but the lie tasted sharp. He looked at me a little too long, as if he could see through the thin calm I was trying to present. His presence stirred something I had been avoiding, the fact that I had pushed him away long before I pushed my belongings out the door. The silence between us felt different from the silence of the room. It felt full of everything we hadn't said, full of the truth I was not ready to face. Jonah asked why I hadn't called him during the purge, and I told him I wanted to do it alone. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't the truth. I hadn't called because I didn't want anyone questioning the version of freedom I was trying to force. He reminded me that minimalism wasn't supposed to isolate me, and something in me tightened. I didn't want to hear that. I wanted this to be simple, clean, controlled. Instead, his concern felt like a spotlight shining directly on the emotional clutter I had tried to ignore. It was easier to let go of objects than to admit I had grown distant from the people who cared. I tried to convince Jonah that I was fine, that the emptiness was part of the process, but he didn't look convinced. He stepped closer, lowering his voice in that careful way he used when he knew I was hiding something. He told me that owning less wouldn't magically make everything inside me quiet. The words stung because they were true. I felt a prick of defensiveness rise in my chest, the same feeling that always surfaced when someone touched the parts of me I protected too fiercely. I realized then that minimalism had become another shield, another way to avoid being vulnerable with the one person who had always tried to understand me. Jonah's voice softened, and he told me he missed how we used to talk. Not about life choices or emotional breakthroughs, just talk. Simple things, small things. I felt something crack quietly inside me. I realized I had been chasing simplicity in objects while complicating the only relationships that mattered. The room around us felt too bright, too open, as if it was urging me to stop hiding. I wanted to reach for honesty, but the words stumbled. I wasn't ready to admit how overwhelmed I felt or how lost I had become. The silence stretched again, fragile but full of possibility if I chose to fill it with something true. Jonah finally stood to leave, lingering at the doorway as if unsure whether to say more. He told me he loved me, and for a moment I felt the weight of everything I had pushed aside. I wanted to reach out, but something inside me held still, caught between fear and longing. After he left, the apartment felt different, not emptier, but sharper, as though his presence had shifted the air. I sat alone on the floor, realizing that this friction wasn't a setback. It was the beginning of the truth I needed. Minimalism hadn't created silence. It had uncovered everything I had buried beneath the noise. Later that week, Aya knocked on my door with the gentle rhythm of someone who never rushed life. She had seen me carrying boxes days earlier and wondered how I was settling in. Her voice carried a kindness that felt strangely disarming. When she invited me over, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to be seen in my unraveling. But something in her eyes made it hard to say no. Stepping into her small apartment across the hall felt like entering a different world. It was simple but warm, quiet, yet alive. Nothing felt forced or curated. It made me realize that emptiness wasn't the same as peace, and minimalism didn't guarantee meaning. Aya's presence alone made the air feel softer, and for the first time in days, I felt my shoulders loosen. Aya's apartment felt like a quiet heartbeat. Everything she owned had a place. Not because she believed in strict order, but because she treated her space like a companion instead of a project. Her home was small, but it held warmth that mine completely lacked. She poured tea and sat beside me, asking nothing heavy, just how I'd been sleeping and whether I'd eaten anything comforting lately. Her questions were simple, but they reached deeper than I expected. It struck me that peace didn't come from subtracting objects, but from the way people touched the spaces they lived in. And Aya seemed to touch hers with tenderness I hadn't felt in a long time. Aya spoke about the beauty of letting spaces breathe, but she also spoke about presence. The kind you build from within. Not the kind you chase by removing things. She mentioned that emptiness can be healing only when it's filled with intention, not avoidance. Her words settled over me gently, like a soft blanket warming the parts of me I had left uncovered. I realized then that my apartment felt empty because I was empty in the wrong ways. I wasn't cultivating peace. I was hiding from myself. Aya didn't try to fix me or push me. She simply showed me what calm looked like when it wasn't forced. And something inside me began to shift. As I traced my fingers across the simple objects on Aya's shelf, a small wooden bird, a hand-painted bowl, a single framed photograph, I felt something loosen inside me. None of these things were expensive or remarkable, yet each held a story. Aya explained that meaning comes from connection, not quantity. Her voice was steady, serene, as if she carried decades of understanding without needing to decorate it. And in that moment, I understood what my apartment was missing. Not possessions, meaning. Not distractions, I had emptied my space, but I had forgotten to fill it with myself. When I left Aya's apartment, the hallway felt different, as if something inside me had been gently rearranged. Stepping into my own home, the emptiness no longer felt like a failure, but like a beginning. I stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly, letting the silence settle without fear. I realized that minimalism wasn't supposed to erase me. It was supposed to clarify me, and for the first time since the purge, I felt a quiet sense of possibility. A feeling that maybe the emptiness wasn't asking for perfection. Maybe it was asking for presence. That night, The quiet hit me differently. Aya's warmth had softened something, but it also exposed how deeply I'd been avoiding myself. I sat on the floor with the single box I hadn't opened yet, the one filled with things I didn't have the courage to face. As I lifted the lid, memories rose like dust, unsteady, unwanted, familiar. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't about clutter. It was about the parts of my life I had pushed into corners, hoping they'd disappear if I buried them under enough busyness. The emptiness around me echoed every truth I wanted to ignore, and in that moment, I felt myself unraveling. Not because I had too little, but because I finally had nothing left to hide behind. Inside the box was everything I had avoided. Old letters, photos, pieces of a past I tried to outgrow without ever grieving. I held a picture of Jonah and me from years ago, smiling in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. My throat tightened as I realized how far I had drifted, not just from him, but from myself. The room felt colder as memories pressed in, each one reminding me what I had tried to erase by clearing shelves and drawers. I thought minimalism would fix the heaviness inside me, but now I understood the weight had never come from objects. It came from absence, of connection, of honesty, of healing I'd never allowed myself to begin. As I sifted through the memories, guilt washed over me in waves. I remembered all the times Jonah tried to reach me, all of the moments I brushed past real conversations because they felt too heavy. I realized how long I'd been hiding behind the idea of simplifying, afraid to admit I didn't know how to handle the deeper weight I carried. My space wasn't empty by accident. I had made it empty because I believed emptiness would protect me. But now it only reflected what I had been running from. And for the first time, I let myself feel it all. The regret, the grief, the fear. It was messy and painful, but it was real. The more I allowed myself to feel, the more the silence shifted. It no longer felt like punishment. It felt like space. Space to finally acknowledge the truth I had escaped for years. I realized I had used minimalism as a mask, a perfect excuse to avoid confronting the parts of myself that terrified me. I thought if I let go of everything, I could start fresh without carrying the past. But the past clung to me because I had never given it a place to rest. I pressed a hand to my chest, letting the ache settle instead of fighting it. For the first time, I wasn't trying to escape. I was trying to understand. By the time I closed the box again, I felt drained but strangely grounded. The emptiness around me no longer felt like a void. It felt like a pause. A space waiting for honesty instead of perfection. I knew I couldn't keep running from Jonah or from myself. The fall I feared had already happened. All that was left now was the slow climb back up. I sat in the stillness, letting the room breathe with me. The quiet didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt like a truth teller. And for the first time since giving everything away, I felt a fragile sense of direction forming. Faint but real. The next morning I stepped outside for air, unsure of what I was looking for. The world felt muted around me, as if it was waiting for me to catch up to something I'd been avoiding. That's when I met him, Elias, sitting quietly on the bench by the entrance, sketching the building as if it held a secret only he could see. When he looked up, his expression carried the softness of someone who lived lightly in the world without running from it. He asked if I lived here, and I nodded, too tired to pretend I had it all figured out. There was something grounding in the way he observed me, not with curiosity, but with understanding, as though he sensed the heaviness I carried before I said a word. Elias asked how I liked living in the quiet building. I let out a small laugh I didn't realize I had been holding. I told him it was quiet inside my apartment too quiet. He didn't rush me or try to make the silence comfortable. He just listened. When I mentioned giving away most of my things, he nodded thoughtfully and said that emptiness can reveal truth, but it can also reveal fear. His words settled into me like a stone dropped in still water. I felt the ripples immediately. For the first time, someone had named exactly what I had been struggling with. It wasn't minimalism that felt heavy. It was the fear beneath it. Elias didn't offer advice, just a simple truth. Sometimes we empty our lives because we're too afraid to empty our hearts. His voice wasn't harsh or dramatic. It was steady, like someone who had learned the hard way. The words hit deeper than I expected, stirring something raw inside me. I realized how much I had been hiding behind the idea of simplicity, afraid to face the complicated parts of my past. Talking to him felt like standing in a mirror that didn't distort anything. I suddenly saw how lonely I had made myself. Not by emptying my space, but by shutting people out. And if I didn't want that to continue, I knew I needed to face Jonah next. By afternoon, I stood outside Jonah's door, my heart beat louder than any silence in my apartment. I knew I couldn't fix everything in one conversation, but I also knew I couldn't keep pretending I didn't need him. When he opened the door, surprise flickered across his face, then softened into something warm. I told him I hadn't been honest, with him or with myself. The words were shaky, but they were real. Jonah didn't interrupt. He just listened, the way he always had. And in that moment, the tension that had stretched between us for years finally began to loosen. Once inside, Jonah and I sat on his couch, the familiar scent of his home grounding me. I told him everything. How I had used minimalism to avoid feelings. How the silence inside my apartment finally forced me to see what I'd been hiding from. He didn't judge me. He just placed a hand on my shoulder and reminded me I didn't need to face anything alone. Tears gathered before I could stop them. For the first time in a long while, I let myself break. Not into pieces, but into honesty. And Jonah stayed beside me, steady and warm, proving that connection fills a room more deeply than any object ever could. The morning after Jonah and I talked, I woke feeling different. Not entirely lighter, but steadier. The silence in my apartment no longer hovered like a threat. It felt more like a pause, a breath, a moment waiting for intention instead of avoidance. I walked slowly across the room, noticing the way the light settled on the floor, how the air felt softer than before. Something in me had shifted. Not because the room changed, but because I had. I realized that emptiness wasn't meant to save me. It was meant to give me space to choose what mattered. And now, for the first time, I felt ready to fill my life with presence instead of fear. I spent the day slowly choosing what pieces of my life I wanted to welcome back, not to fill space, but to honor it. A small table from storage, a single framed photo of Jonah and me, a handmade bowl Aya gifted me. Each object felt like an act of grounding, not a distraction. As I placed them around the room, the emptiness didn't disappear. It transformed. It became a kind of balance, a reminder that space could be both quiet and alive. I realized I wasn't rebuilding a home of things. I was rebuilding a home of meaning. In the afternoon, Aya visited. She stepped inside and smiled softly, as if she could feel the shift before I said anything. I told her the silence didn't feel empty anymore. She nodded, saying that a home becomes peaceful not when it is bare, but when it is honest. Her words landed gently, like petals settling on still water. I felt gratitude swell in my chest. Not for the minimalism itself, but for the people who helped me understand what simplicity truly meant. It wasn't about less. It was about presence, intention, connection. Things I had been starved for without knowing it. Later, as evening settled, I found myself reflecting on the journey that brought me here. I had chased emptiness expecting freedom, but freedom had come from honesty instead. The room around me no longer felt like a void demanding answers. It felt like a canvas waiting for intention. I understood now that minimalism wasn't about stripping life bare. It was about stripping away the noise so the truth could finally be heard. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what that truth revealed. I felt rooted, present, alive. As night embraced the apartment, I realized that freedom wasn't found in the act of giving things away. It was found in the courage to stop running from myself. The emptiness I once feared had become a quiet companion, a space where I could choose what mattered and let go of what didn't. I stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly, feeling a sense of clarity that wasn't sharp or dramatic, just steady. And in that moment, I finally understood. Simplicity wasn't supposed to fix me. It was supposed to make room for me to grow.